Heartbreaking moment, billionaire's life changed forever after a street girl's shocking meal, in the heart of a bustling city, where sleek skyscrapers pierced the sky and the hum of luxury cars filled the streets, a striking moment unfolded that would alter a billionaire's life forever. It wasn't found in boardrooms or lavish galas, but on a graffiti-covered sidewalk, where the grit of life collided with a bewildering twist of fate. It was a day like any other, or so Richard Sterling thought, as he navigated his black Lexus through the congested traffic. Little did he know, destiny was about to tap him on the shoulder in the most unexpected way. As he sat in the car, staring out through tinted windows, he caught sight of something unusual: a girl, no more than 10 years old, seated on the cold concrete, her worn-out clothes hanging off her frail frame. She looked like a ghost against the vibrant street art, clutching a half-eaten sandwich that seemed as stale as yesterday's news. Richard's heart twisted at the sight. But what caught his breath and kept it locked in a vice was the intense look of determination on her face as she carefully split the meager food with a scrappy dog at her side. There was something riveting about that act of sharing. It pierced through the layers of Richard's hardened heart. The air crackled with unspoken secrets the moment he parked his car and stepped out. As he approached, gasps echoed around him. Spectators were drawn to the oddities of the scene, a wealthy businessman in sharp attire facing off against the raw, unrefined spirit of poverty. It was too odd, too striking, and yet, it felt like something else, something the city only whispered about, the unnameable connection that could bind a billionaire to a street girl. Richard knelt down in front of her, heart racing as he felt the pulse of disbelief in the air. "What's your name?" he managed, his voice wavering. The girl's gaze met his, fierce and unreadable, and for a heartbeat, the world around him faded away. Suddenly, the crowds hushed, expecting something monumental. They could feel the tension, they could almost taste the curiosity. "Before we continue, I need to tell you something important. YouTube has been making changes to their system and many people are missing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and select all notifications so you don't miss future videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps me with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen." "Now let's continue," the girl finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper that cut through the expectant silence. "Sophie," she said, as if revealing a treasure. Richard felt a lump form in his throat, an urgency blossoming inside him. He looked around, sensing the shared fascination of the crowd, the way they leaned in, captivated by this single moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, as if the universe decided it was time for the unimaginable to unfold, Sophie reached up with her small, dirt-streaked hand and held it out to him. There was no fear, only a powerful mix of hope and challenge. In that instant, Richard felt a shuddering tremor, his carefully crafted world beginning to unravel. What did this girl know? What would happen if he accepted her invitation? As the rhythm of the city surged in the background, the tension hit a boiling point, ready to explode into something unknown. Richard felt a wave of uncertainty crash over him as he stared at the small hand extended towards him. The world around them faded further, replaced by the sound of his own rapid heartbeat. There was a charge in the air that felt electric. The crowd was a background hum of whispers and incredulous gasps. What came over him? That innocent gaze possessed a magnetic pull, wreaking havoc on his rational thoughts. Could he reach out? He hesitated, fingers trembling slightly as he considered the weight of this spontaneous connection. To take her hand would mean crossing a line he had carefully constructed for himself. Wealthy businessman, safe from the chaos of the streets. Yet the moment she touched him, a bizarre clarity washed over him, as if the grime of the city melted away, revealing something deeply buried within him. Suddenly, the murmur of the crowd grew louder. "What is he doing?" someone asked. "Is he actually going to help her?" Words of disbelief filled the air, but Richard wasn't listening. He crouched, grounding himself on the dirty sidewalk, and clasped Sophie's small hand in his. Her grip was surprisingly strong, filled with tenacity. Then came the moment that shattered the silence. Sophie spoke again, but her words hit like a punch to the gut. You're just like the rest. You see me, but you don't really care. The sting of her accusation cut through him. No, I want to help, he stammered, searching her eyes for understanding, for some sign that he wasn't just another passerby who caught her eye. She shook her head slowly, her expression not changing, like a fierce statue pulled from the shadows. Everyone says they want to help. They all have their wallets open, but nothing ever changes, she whispered, forcing him to confront the walls he had built around his life. The determination in her voice filled the air with an almost tangible weight. As the crowd around them shifted uneasily, Richard felt an urgency swell inside him. He looked beyond Sophie, observing the faces peering over shoulders, each one lost in their own worlds, each a reminder of the divide between them. What can I do? Richard asked, his voice cracking with sincerity. He didn't want to be another empty gesture in her life. Tell me. Sophie pulled her hand back slowly and moved to stand, brushing off the dirt from her knees. Richard stood with her, feeling an odd sense of camaraderie with the tenacity she exuded. The crowd bore witness to their exchange, captivated by the contrasting lives colliding on that stained patch of concrete. I need help getting my mom, Sophie said, strength returned to her voice. But you're not going to just drop off some money and disappear, are you? You have to come with me. Richard's heart raced, adrenaline coursed through his veins. Your mom? He echoed, anxiety overshadowing his eagerness. Where is she? Just up the street, but she's not well. I can't do it alone, Sophie replied, urgency coloring her words. A swirl of emotions flooded Richard: fear, anticipation, hope. What if this was the moment that reshaped his life forever? Would he truly allow himself to step into the unknown? As he weighed the choices in his mind, he caught sight of the tension rising around them, curiosity mingled with pity, judgment with concern. Moments ticked by, a heavy silence enveloping them, the city's pulse fading as the world around Richard felt suspended. At that moment, Richard knew there was no turning back. All right, he said, nodding with determination. Lead the way. But as they took their first step, a deep siren echoed from behind them, pulling everyone's attention toward the chaos that was about to unfold. Richard's heart dropped. What had he just walked into? He exchanged a quick glance with Sophie, confusion mingling with determination, as they prepared to face whatever storm loomed ahead. They moved forward, Sophie leading the way, her small frame cutting through the throng of onlookers. Richard trailed closely behind, the low hum of the crowd quieting, but tension crackled in the air like static. He felt exposed, the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on him. Everyone was watching, but for once, he hadn't cared about the opinions of others. The siren's wail faded, replaced by the distant echo of metal clashing and voices shouting urgently. Anxiety twisted in Richard's gut. Sophie, what exactly are we walking into? Her pace quickened as she shot him a sidelong glance, determination furrowing her brow. You'll see, just trust me, she urged, her tone leaving little room for doubt. They crossed several blocks, the streets morphing from bustling shops to darkened alleys, the air thickening with uncertainty. Richard could feel his own heartbeat matching Sophie's silent urgency. The skyscrapers loomed above them like watching giants, and the stark contrast of their shiny glass exteriors against the gritty surroundings felt surreal. Here! Sophie finally barked as they turned onto a narrow, dimly lit street. Richard's stomach churned, there was a palpable darkness seeping through the cracks in the pavement. Filthy walls surrounded them, graffiti telling stories of despair and resilience beneath flickering streetlights. Sophie stopped in front of a hefty door marked with peeling paint. This is it, my mom's in there. Richard stared at the door, his chest tightening. He could feel it, the unease curling around him like a serpent, hissing doubts about what lay beyond. Are you sure it's safe? He began, but Sophie cut him off. No time. We have to go in. Her voice trembled with urgency that seemed to echo off the walls around them. She knocked forcefully, a sound that felt louder than it should in the thick silence. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a frail figure in the shadows. Sophie's mother stood there, clutching a thin blanket around her shoulders. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he took in her gaunt appearance, dark circles under her weary eyes. The dim light was not kind. Sophie rushed past him, concern written all over her face. "Mom! I'm here." Richard hesitated at the threshold, instinctively holding back. His heart raced as he absorbed the scene. Here was a world he had grappled with his entire life, one he had kept at a safe distance. A loud crash echoed nearby, punctuating the moment and sending a rush of adrenaline through him. Sophie's mother looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing her face, but it was quickly shadowed by confusion. "Who are you?" she rasped, eyes flicking between Sophie and Richard, searching for clarity in the chaos. "He's here to help," Sophie exclaimed desperately. "He came with me. I think we can figure this out together." But before Richard could respond, another scream cut through the air, followed by hurried footsteps. Panic surged within him. He stepped forward instinctively, wanting to protect this fragile moment, but wasn't he sure how to fit into this world he barely understood. "What's happening?" he demanded, eyes darting toward the sound, heart pounding in his ears. A figure emerged from the shadows, unfamiliar and threatening. Richard's instincts screamed as he reached for Sophie, ready to shield her, but uncertainty knotted in his gut. What had he just stepped into? Was he prepared for the storm ahead, or had he underestimated the darkness lurking on these streets? As the tension peaked, a chilling smile spread across the figure's lips, a hint of something dangerous looming as Richard felt the air shift. And then, the room erupted in chaos. Richard's heart raced, a wild rhythm that echoed through the room as the unknown figure advanced. The flickering light barely illuminated a face marked with hard edges and a chilling smile that struck a nerve deep within him. He felt the pull of something primal, a desperate instinct to protect Sophie and her mother from this threat. "Get back!" he shouted, pushing Sophie aside instinctively, his frame blocking hers. His breath hitched as he realized how futile his attempt was. This stranger wasn't just an intruder, there was purpose in that menacing stride. "Oh, so brave," the figure sneered, voice dripping with mockery. "But you'll find that courage only goes so far in this world." Sophie's mother clutched her daughter's arm, her eyes wide, uncomprehending. "What do you want?" she said, her voice quaking. "Please, we don't have anything. Just leave us alone." "Nothing to steal, but oh, you have more than you know," the figure said, glancing past Richard, eyes settling on Sophie's mother. "The game's just begun, and you're all players now." Richard felt a surge of protective anger, each word carving deeper into him like a knife. "This isn't a game. Who are you?" He stepped forward, fists clenched, ready to defend the only family that stood before him. The man's smile widened. "Ah, the gallant hero. Too bad you don't know who you're up against." He took another step forward, and without warning, he lunged directly at Richard. A moment later, the world exploded into chaos. Richard sidestepped just as the figure swung, the air whooshing past him, a split-second miracle. He grabbed for the nearest object, a broken chair leg discarded in the shadows, and aimed it at the intruder with shaky hands. "Stand back!" Richard shouted again, adrenaline lacing his voice, even as doubt twisted in his gut. How had things spiraled so far so quickly? Sophie pushed past him, her own fear morphing into fierce resolve. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice sharp and commanding. "Foolish girl," the stranger whispered venomously, now fixated on her, watching, waiting. Richard felt the wave of dread wash over him, realizing Sophie was right in the line of fire. In an instant, the figure lunged again, but Richard moved faster, crashing into him with all the force he could muster. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs, Richard scrambling to gain the upper hand. Panic became electric, combining with rage as Richard found himself grappling with the man's thick coat, struggling amidst the desperate blows being thrown. He barely registered Sophie pulling her mother behind the far wall, the sound of their whispered fears barely reaching his ears through the haze of chaos. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed behind them. This was no longer just a conflict with a stranger. Something larger was at play. The sounds of distress and hurried shouts from outside filled the air, and Richard froze for a heartbeat, awareness crashing down on him. "What's happening out there?" he gasped, his grip loosening just enough for the stranger to twist free. "Don't look away," the figure hissed, a desperate urgency creeping into his voice, suddenly revealing a hint of fear as he sneered. Richard's eyes darted to the door, just in time to see shadowy figures approaching, their silhouettes cutting through the dim light. Rising panic and instinct warned him, whatever awaited behind that door would not be in their favor. "Now you'll see," the figure whispered, creeping back toward the wall. "This is more than you bargained for." And as the door swung wide, revealing chaos and a tide of approaching danger, Richard knew their fight was only just beginning. Sophie's terrified whisper broke through the din, "What do we do now?" As the shadows spilled into the room, Richard could only wonder, would they find a way to escape, or was this merely the beginning of something far worse? The door crashed open, and a wave of darkness poured into the room. Richard's heart raced faster than he thought possible, every nerve ending wired with fear. The figures stepped forward, silhouettes dark against the dim light, their faces obscured, but the intent was clear. They were here for more than just a game. "Run!" Richard yelled at Sophie, his voice cracking under the weight of urgency. He pushed himself to his feet, grappling with confusion and instinct. He couldn't let these shadows engulf them, not when he still had a chance to fight back. Sophie's mother was frozen in place, eyes glued to the intimidating figures that stood at the threshold, her mind racing in desperate confusion. "What do they want?" she stammered, shivering beneath the weight of panic. "Stop asking questions and just..." Richard glanced back, but Sophie was already moving, her small frame darting across the room. "We need to move," he urged her, but fear became an anchor, keeping her still. The intruder who had initially attacked Richard stepped back, blending into the chaos. His wicked smile returned. "Welcome to the show," he sneered, his voice smooth as silk but laced with danger. "Trust me, you wouldn't want to miss the grand finale." Before Richard could react, the figures surged forward. He rushed toward Sophie, a primal need to shield her overpowering the nausea encoding his thoughts. He grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her toward the far side of the room. Suddenly, muffled screams echoed from the street outside, abruptly slicing through the tension. Richard glanced toward the window, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "What's happening?" he muttered under his breath. Outside, chaos reigned, shadows flitted in the flickering streetlights, movements sudden and erratic. It was as though a storm had erupted, furious and wild, outside their sanctuary. "Get down!" Richard shouted, crouching low while pulling Sophie and her mother behind a sofa, its fabric rough against their skin. He could feel the tremors in her hand, a mirror to the deeper fear nesting in him. The men tightened their grip around the doorframe, expressions unreadable but palpable rage leaking from their forms. The energy in the air shifted, a charged silence falling over them, heavy with anticipation. "You can't hide forever," one of them finally called out, the threat unmistakable in his tone. As Richard's mind raced, searching for a plan, he caught a glimpse of something shiny on the floor, an overturned kitchen knife. His heart leapt as he realized it was his only chance. He leaned over and grabbed it, feeling its cold weight settle in his palm like a promise. The figures seemed to sense his movement, the air thick with their malice sharpening into focus. Richard felt guilt stab at him. Was he bringing them into greater danger? But there was no time for doubt. Sophie's mother, catching on to his determination, squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "We have to be strong," she breathed, her voice steadying enough to bolster Sophie's resolve. "We can fight," Sophie shouted, her eyes gleaming with raw defiance. Richard could only nod. A small flicker of hope ignited inside him, something primal challenging the fear that had gripped them all. "On three," he whispered, "we move." You trust me?" They nodded, and for the first time since the chaos began, he felt a surge of confidence. He steadied himself, counting down in his head, pulse pounding like a war drum. Suddenly, the door shuddered as a heavy boot slammed against it, startling them into action. 1, 2, 3. With adrenaline fueling every move, Richard burst forward, the knife gleaming. As the first of the men stepped in, it was now or never. The dim light caught furious eyes gleaming with anticipation. And as Richard charged into the darkness, the question loomed like a specter: was this their moment of escape or the final stand? Richard lunged forward, knife gripped tightly in his hand. Time slowed as he charged toward the first figure stepping through the door, a hulking mass of menace. Their eyes locked for a fleeting moment, and he saw the flicker of surprise transform into vicious glee. The blade came down with a fierce adrenaline-fueled thrust, aiming right for the open space between the man's ribs. But the figure sidestepped, fast and agile, and Richard's knife nicked the doorframe instead. The wood splintered, and a sharp jolt of pain skittered up his arm. "Get her out!" he shouted to Sophie's mother, desperation seeping into his voice as he pivoted to face the throng. Sophie's mother hesitated, her face pale as she glanced back at the trembling girl beside her. "Now!" Richard barked, as more figures flooded into the room, dark silhouettes merging with the shadows cast by the feeble light. Sophie grabbed her mother's hand, eyes wide with terror. "I can't leave him," she cried out, but Richard shook his head, unwilling to let them stay. "I'll hold them off. Just go." The words hung in the air, heavy with sacrifice. Sophie's mother clutched her daughter's shoulders, urging her forward. With a brave nod, they tore themselves away through the chaos, darting toward the back of the house. Richard faced the intruders, heart pounding as they encroached with sinister intent. He could feel their breath, the tension crackling like static electricity. One stepped forward, raising a menacing fist, while another brandished a chain, glinting ominously in the dim light. With every ounce of strength, Richard lunged again, knife aimed, but as he swung, the attacker ducked and countered with a brutal blow to Richard's side. Pain exploded through his ribs, searing his breath into a choked gasp. He stumbled backward but managed to regain his footing. "Is this really all you have?" the attacker mocked, grinning wide, exposing crooked teeth. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Richard hissed, though doubt crept like a shadow across his mind, siphoning his resolve. He wouldn't let the fear take him. He couldn't. Suddenly, a shriek pierced the air. It was Sophie's mother, echoing from somewhere in the depths of the house, a sound filled with despair and panic. The sound ignited a fire deep within him. Without thinking, Richard darted toward the sound. As he tore through the hallway, adrenaline surged again, thrumming in his veins like a war cry. He caught a glimpse of Sophie and her mother at the end of the corridor, two figures trembling, back against the wall, cornered by another intruder. "Let them go!" Richard shouted, knife raised, voice steady, igniting a momentary stillness as the tension thickened. The intruder laughed, derision coating every word. "Brave man, stupid man. You think you can protect them? You will pay for your meddling." Richard surged forward, fueled by a blend of fear and determination. The room vibrated with chaos, emotions collided as he clashed with the intruder, cold metal meeting flesh, desperation driving his actions. With every exchange, hearts raced, breaths came fast. Richard's resolve splintered against the train of threats charging toward him, but Sophie's frightened face pushed him to keep fighting. He couldn't let them down. Just as he thought he had a chance, a third figure appeared at the end of the hallway, blocking the exit. Their intentions hostile, eyes glimmering with malice. "I'm not done yet," Richard thought, heart hammering in time with his blood, but in this deadly game of cat and mouse, the stakes had never been higher. What awaited him, lurking just beyond the next corner? Would Sophie and her mother escape the clutches of shadows, or would they be dragged back, lost under an irredeemable fate? Determined not to let fear consume him, he steeled himself for what lay ahead. He never expected what he would have to sacrifice to uncover the truth. Richard's heart raced as he faced the encroaching threat. The hall felt constricted now, the walls pressing in like a vengeful audience. He locked eyes with the intruder, the one wielding the chain, who flicked it lightly, sending a shiver of dread through Richard's spine. Just as he prepared to move, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. It jolted him, freezing the confrontation for a heartbeat. Sophie and her mother stood behind him, faces pale and terror-stricken, mirroring the emotional storm raging inside him. He could almost hear the frantic beating of their hearts, merging with the low growl of the men surrounding them. The chain swung overhead, slicing the air with a whip-like crack. Richard instinctively ducked, the movement prompting a grunt of frustration from the attacker. In that split second, Richard surged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light. The blade bit into flesh, drawing a gurgling scream from the chain-wielding figure. Blood sprayed in an arc, vivid and shocking against the dark backdrop of the hallway. Still, the fight wasn't over. The attacker stumbled back but regained momentum, lunging forward with rage. Richard barely had time to react. Another figure from the shadows joined the fray, their fists flying as they hammered Richard's side again. Pain sizzled through him, muddling his vision as he spun away, desperate to maintain balance. "Run!" He yelled back at Sophie, trying to ground himself, his voice raw and urgent. She stood frozen, fear locked tight in her chest. Richard could see her mother tugging at her, but they seemed glued to the spot. Once more, the hallway trembled with chaos. Richard's focus narrowed, adrenaline sharpening his instincts. He rolled aside just in time to dodge another strike, his breath hitching as he landed hard against the wooden floor. "Enough of this!" snarled the one with chain, now furious and bleeding. Richard pushed himself up, his body screaming in agony, but he couldn't let up. The instinct to protect those innocent lives consumed him. Then a glimmer caught Richard's eye, just a flash of something metallic on the ground beside him. He lunged toward it, fingers wrapping around a broken shard of glass, sharp and jagged. With a swift movement, Richard slashed out, catching the second figure across the cheek. The intruder howled, staggering back. The shock of defiance spurred Richard's adrenaline. It rejuvenated him enough to turn and face the first attacker, whose face now was twisted in a mix of fury and disbelief. "Get out of here!" He barked again at Sophie, eyes wild and pleading, hoping the urgency of his voice would snap them from their paralysis, but Sophie's gaze was still fixed on him, a mirror to his own turmoil. "What about you?" She was trembling, her mother holding her tightly from behind. "Just go." Richard couldn't keep the desperation out of his voice. But there was a flicker of resolve in Sophie's eyes, the determination he had seen before in stronger times. Yet the figures closing in like a pack of wolves bore down on him, shadows stretching, a claustrophobic nightmare unfurling. Suddenly, a slow, thunderous footfall echoed from down the hall, making everyone pause. The intruders exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. Richard's heart sank. Another one? A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, menacing, cloaked in shadow. They reached up, tugging their hood back to reveal a scarred face hiding behind an unsettling grin. Their presence washed over the scene like a storm, the air thickening with their palpable malice. "Well, well," the newcomer purred, surveying the chaos before them. "Look what we have here. A little party without me?" Time seemed to freeze, every breath hanging in the air like shattered glass. Richard's heart thudded in his chest, the fight slipping away as chill dread crawled down his spine. Was this the end? Had his sacrifices meant nothing against the dark tide rising before them? The only thing Richard knew as the shadowy figure advanced was that this fight was far from over. What had he awakened within? These walls? The figure advanced, each step deliberate, as Richard felt the weight of despair settling onto his shoulders. The shadows twisted around the intruder like sentient beings, drawn to their malevolence. Richard's grip tightened on the shard of glass, but doubt gnawed at him. Was this really a fight he could win? Sophie's mother, gasping quietly, finally broke the spell. We need to go now, she urged, her voice breaking as she tugged at her daughter. But Sophie, transfixed by the unfolding horror, hesitated, her eyes darting between the attackers and Richard, who was battling his own demons alongside physical ones. Mom, Sophie whispered, as if weighing the chance to escape versus the need to help. Richard felt a spark of irritation slicing through his agony. Don't think, he shouted, his voice hoarse. Just move. But the scarred figure was close now, looming like an ominous storm cloud. Oh, you poor little thing, the intruder said, the taunt draping over Richard like a heavy fog. Caught between two choices, fight and likely die, or run away like a coward. With every second, Richard felt more chained to the ground, his spirit waning. Memories surged, uninvited laughs shared, quiet moments under starlit skies. He couldn't bear that they might end here, in darkness, swallowed by these monsters. Show me your courage, hero, the scarred figure continued, a grin spreading across their face, as Richard's knuckles went white around the shard. The twisted pleasure in their gaze sent a wave of fury rippling through him. If he was going to go down, it would not be without a fight. Suddenly, the chain wielder lunged at him, gap-toothed snarl pressing closer. Richard barely had time to react. He swung the glass shard with everything left in his body, arcing it toward the roguish face. The glass found purchase against flesh it connected. A sharp scream erupted, but it felt distant, dulled by adrenaline. Neither rage nor triumph coursed through him, the chase was a haunting whisper, as a weight fell heavy on his heart. In that heartbeat, the scarred figure howled in surprise, lurching backward. Richard turned, catching sight of Sophie's terrified expression, her mother frantically pulling her towards the exit. They would leave, he couldn't let them suffer this horror. You have to fight. The small voice in his head shrieked, battling against his body's exhaustion. With a defiant cry, he surged toward Sophie, desperate to steer her away from the terror closing in. Go, go, go! He shouted over his shoulder, adrenaline kicking up another notch. But then, a torrential crash shook the floor. The lights flickered ominously, dancing shadows mocking his efforts. Richard spun around just in time to see another crouched figure subtly emerge from the dark, revealing themselves as a different kind of predator entirely. This one did not carry chains but something far more sinister, a gleaming weapon that glinted in the dim light like a snake ready to strike. Sophie! Richard shouted, twisting to shield her, but she was rooted to the spot, every muscle rigid as fear threatened to consume the moment. The new figure smiled, a predatory smirk that sliced through the thickening tension. Oh, my, this will be fun, they mused, slicking a finger along the length of their weapon, eyes twinkling with malevolence. Richard felt the walls closing in, panic spiraling. Was this what he had awakened? Each tick of the seconds drummed in his chest, fear gnawing at his resolve. He couldn't let Sophie and her mother fall into this dark world. The horror now was palpable, pressing tight against his ribs as he prepared to face whatever calamity these creatures would unleash, but with the flicker of hope igniting in his chest, he knew he'd do everything to keep that glimmer alive. Would they even stand a chance in this web of darkness? Richard's heart raced, each beat pounding louder than the last. He could see Sophie's frightened eyes, her small frame trembling against her mother's grip. The moment hung thick and heavy, tar-like in the air. He knew what he had to do. Stay behind me, he shouted, barely holding back his rising panic as he glared at the new threat. The figure with the weapon twisted it expertly in their hand, reflecting the dim light, casting erratic glimmers across the room like flashes from a warning signal. Brave little hero, aren't we? The figure taunted, their grin widening as if Richard's fear only fueled their pleasure. They lunged suddenly, advancing with a speed that caught Richard off guard. Richard swung the shard in a wild arc, desperation fueling his movements. The blade clashed against metal, an explosive sound ringing through the tense atmosphere, reverberating in the small space. The shock sent a jolt through his body, but he couldn't back down now. No matter how frightened he felt, he couldn't abandon Sophie. The predator responded with a vicious laugh, the sound slithering into Richard's ears, sharp and jagged. "Is this your idea of bravery? You should know, it only takes one mistake." In that fleeting moment, Richard saw the sadness in Sophie's gaze. She was nonetheless a child, too young to bear such fear. It steeled him. He tightened his grip on the glass shard and started to circle the assailant, keeping Sophie and her mother behind him. "You can't have them. We're leaving." "Oh, sweetheart," the figure crooned mockingly. "You think you can walk out of here? You're already in too deep." They lunged forward again, weapon glimmering dangerously. Richard twisted just in time, dodging a swift thrust that sliced through the air where he stood just moments before. He could feel sweat trickling down his spine, chills racing like fire through his veins. Adrenaline surged as he swiped at the attacker again, this time the shard finding its mark against their forearm. A grunt of surprise escaped the assailant. Richard glanced back, checking on Sophie. A fleeting echo of relief crashed over him. She wasn't moving, but at least her mother maintained a firm grip on her. "Run!" he shouted desperately, hoping to drown out the noise, the chaos, the creeping dread. But instead, the shout only drew the predator's attention back to him. "Stay right there, little hero. Let's finish this dance," they said with a seductive menace, lunging again, sword aimed straight at Richard's heart. He dodged, instinctively rolling to the side, hearing the sharp hiss of the blade slicing through the air mere inches from his back. He scrambled upright, breathing heavily, trying to fathom how he could turn the tide. His thoughts raced. He needed a plan, a distraction, anything to buy for time. Suddenly, a noise shattered the chaos, a distant banging, heavy footsteps approaching from the other room. It echoed ominously up the corridor, sending a shudder down Richard's spine. Something or someone else was on its way. The intruder's eyes widened momentarily, glancing toward the source of the sound. "A party crasher?" they hissed, shifting their focus back to Richard. "You're lucky, little hero, but don't get too comfortable. This isn't over." Another crash reverberated through the hall, breaking the standoff, momentarily pushing the attacker off balance. "Sophie, now!" Richard roared, his voice a mix of authority and fear. They had to seize this chance. Richard turned fully, raking everything inside him to push forward, ready to battle whatever came next. But as he sprinted toward the door with Sophie trailing behind, he caught a glimpse of the fluid shadows drifting closer, dark shapes undulating on the edges of vision. What was waiting for them out there? Could they truly escape this nightmare? The looming question hung in the air, and the nightmares were just beginning. The chaos erupted around them like a freight train barreling toward its destination, and Richard's mind raced with possibilities. The weight of each second pressed heavily on him as he reached for both Sophie and her mother, desperation pooling in his chest. "Move! Now!" he thundered, steeling his resolve against the oncoming storm of dark figures. Sophie's small hand slipped into his, her grip a lifeline amidst the chaos. Her wide eyes reflected a mixture of fear and determination. Richard could feel the heat of her urgency, each heartbeat echoing the unrelenting pounding of his own heart. Just as they were about to break free down the hallway, the door splintered open wider. A new figure emerged, taller and more imposing than the rest. A cold shiver danced along Richard's spine. Each step it took resonated with an eerie confidence. "Where do you think you're going?" it hissed, an unsettling glint in its eyes. The energy in the air shifted, the tension palpable enough to slice through. "Get back!" Richard shouted, adrenaline spiking as he moved to shield Sophie and her mother again. But even as he spoke, he could feel the dread clawing at him. He needed to create a chance, a window to escape. Sophie's mother tugged at her hand, urging them both backward for a moment's reprieve, and Richard seized that opportunity. He glanced around, his eyes darting for any sign of escape, ideas colliding chaotically in his mind. Then he thought of the kitchen, a small chance at gaining an advantage. "This way!" he shouted, already sprinting back toward the cramped space, pulling them along with him. The room felt small, the shadows seeming to curl around them like ominous claws. But the chaos behind, booming with ominous footsteps, edged closer, hungry. "Richard, please!" Sophie called out, her voice pleading. The girl had seen horrors too big for her small heart, and the tightness in Richard's chest constricted painfully. But he had to push through. Not just for himself, but for her. Holding tightly to the shard of glass that had become an extension of his will, Richard scanned the kitchen for anything that might help: knives, pots, or even tools. That he saw a small window behind the sink. It was too high, but maybe he could hoist Sophie up. His heart hammered louder, drowning out the impending chaos. "Sophie!" He quickly turned to her, urgency flowing through his voice. "I need you to trust me. I think we can get out through that window. I just need you to climb and go first." Sophie hesitated, glancing back toward her mother, fear spilling over into her wide eyes. "What if you don't make it?" The thought sliced through Richard. With everything hanging in the balance, he resolved. "If I don't make it, you have to promise me you'll run. Just go. Please." Sophie bit her lip, then nodded fiercely. It was a moment of understanding that filled the air with an exquisite tension. There was no time, only instinct. That he knelt, ready to lift her up, when the sound of growling laughter from the hallway echoed ominously. The shadows were inching closer, each movement embodying a sinister promise of violence. The intruders were regrouping. Richard had until that moment to make a break. Richard's voice shattered the tension. "Now!" He hoisted Sophie onto his shoulders, adrenaline pulsing in time with his racing heart. "Climb!" Sophie scrambled, reaching for the ledge, but it was slow, and the figures were closer now. Richard's breath quickened, sensing time slipping away like grains of sand. He gritted his teeth and pushed, lifting her as high as he could. Meanwhile, he felt a surge of determination course through him. He wouldn't let her mother's trust falter. "Can you reach?" he urged, forcing his eyes toward the pair of desperate faces urging her on. I think I can," Sophie stammered. "Then do it." With a swift motion, Sophie lunged upward, fingers grazing the windowsill, and in that instant, Richard felt a surge of hope. She tugged herself up, able to barrel through the escape, and with a quick look back her expression was one of fright mingled with newfound courage. Point 2. Men honed in on the kitchen, shadows gathering and closing in, but Richard wasn't about to give in. "Get ready!" he shouted, hearing their frantic whispers grow louder. As Sophie tucked her legs onto the window ledge and began to scale her way through, he felt the wall crash against him, a force slinging down the hallway. Richard turned, eyes meeting the stare of the foremost attacker as they raised a knife, ready to strike. He pivoted, mirroring every harrowing breath. "Let them go!" he bellowed, facing the swirl of encroaching darkness, feeling terror and energy pulse through him simultaneously. He stepped forward, everything blurring together, understanding that this moment was for the innocent, for Sophie. One last time, with a swift surge of adrenaline, Richard lunged at the nearest figure. Their tussle was visceral, chaotic, but a missed connection showed them both faltering. He couldn't think of the consequences. Fighting to give Sophie life meant everything. With another primal scream, Richard knocked the weapon from the man's grasp. The blade clanged against the tile, pain ricocheting through him as he pushed the figure into the wall enough that it reeled, granting him precious seconds. Sophie yelled again, "Mom! Come on!" Urgency rising in her tone. Richard turned, reaching out for the pair. "Go! Get out! Mom! Please!" Sophie whimpered, pulling on her mother's hand. "I'm coming!" her mother cried, scrambling to leap toward the window beside her daughter. Richard felt a crushing weight as the figures began to regroup, nudging closer. Sophie's mother squeezed her hand one last time, lifting herself into the window, barely making it before no. Richard shouted, just as he felt the cold hardness of hands grabbing him, and in that heartbeat, something shifted. The last image he saw was of Sophie peering back, her eyes wide with disbelief and desperation. He didn't feel fear, just the warmth of hope. In that instant, amidst the grasp of cold fingers, he thought of the girl who had fiercely defied fate. The moment between them echoed in his mind. Richard had to keep fighting, for her new chance at life. Sophie broke free, and behind her, her mother followed, tumbling into the soft darkness outside. Richard felt himself pulled down, the shadows coiling tighter. But this wasn't the end. It was only till next time the world spun, and silence engulfed him, and in that silence, hope flickered. Time passed like an echo. Then, Richard awoke to a new dawn. The ache in his body reminded him of the battle, but the light was blinding. A second chance, a rebirth. He stumbled outside into the sun and saw something familiar. Movement in the distance, with a spark of hope emptying every weight in his soul. Richard moved toward it. As he grew closer, he saw it, a small figure wrapped in an embrace, her mother smiling, their happiness surrounding them like sunshine. That silhouette was everything, a reminder that in every darkness, there is light. Sophie turned, eyes now a beacon of the life ahead. Richard felt the weight lift, his heart bursting with the gravity of connection. They had made it. He wasn't a billionaire anymore, he was a man changed. No longer hungry for riches but for more beautiful moments to cherish. Richard stepped into their world, filled with joy and possibility, ready to embrace the unknown a second time. The end had become a new beginning. You need to subscribe now so you don't miss the next exclusive stories. Smash the like button now to feed the algorithm. Flood the comments section with your reactions and theories about this conclusion. And don't wait even one more second to share this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion. Show your support. Every action helps keep the story alive.